By the time I turned off the highway and rolled into the shopping plaza outside Chillicothe, most of the place was already dark. The big stores on the far end had gone black an hour earlier. A nail salon sat behind a metal grate. The pizza place still had its sign on, but the dining room chairs were up on the tables, and the parking spots in front were empty. A laundromat across the lot hummed under white light, and past that there was nothing but long strips of asphalt, tired yellow lamps, and the dark line of trees beyond the service road. The only building still trying to look awake was the theater. The sign over Parkline Cinemas 8 was missing a little of its blue in one corner, and two of the poster boxes out front were dark. From the road it had looked almost normal, just old and underfunded, same as half the places along that stretch. Sitting there in the lot with my engine running, it looked like the last business left open in a town that had already gone home. I shut the car off and sat there for a second with both hands on the wheel. The dashboard clock said 10:07 p.m. The air inside the car had gone cold, but I left the heater off anyway. Gas mattered now. Everything mattered now. The room at the Coachlight Inn was paid through Friday morning, and if I didn't get through the week without dipping too hard into what I had left, maybe I could keep the lie standing a little longer. Maybe Ron Bellamy would finally call and tell me the shutdown at the old place was getting sorted out. Maybe I could go back to doing work that actually belonged to me, not pushing a mop through a movie theater at midnight. I'd been telling myself some version of that for almost 2 weeks. My mother still thought I was on temporary assignment. That was the phrase I'd used. Temporary assignment. It sounded better than laid off and too embarrassed to come home. She lived outside Waverly. Same house, same kitchen light over the sink, same habit of asking if I'd eaten before she asked anything else. I could have driven back there any night I wanted. It wasn't even an hour. That was the worst part. Home wasn't far. I just couldn't stand the thought of walking through that door and watching her realize I'd been lying to her face. So I got out of the car, zipped my jacket, and crossed the lot toward the side of the building where the employee entrance sat under a dim wall light and a camera dome spotted with dead bugs. The front doors were still unlocked for the last customers drifting out, but I'd already been told to use the back after 10. I passed the posters, the blue neon trim, the trash can near the entrance full of popcorn tubs and soda lids, and followed the building around to the service door. The farther I got from the main entrance, the more the place stopped feeling like a theater and started feeling like the backside of any other business in America. Dumpsters, wet concrete, a stack of flattened cardboard tied with plastic, the low mechanical hum from roof units somewhere overhead. The service door opened before I had to knock twice. Raymond Pritchard stood there with a clipboard tucked under one arm and a ring of keys hanging from 2 fingers. He was older than I remembered from the interview, or maybe the light was just worse back there. Thin gray hair, narrow shoulders under a faded work jacket, the kind of face that looked carved by years of bad sleep and cheap overhead lighting. "You made it." "Yeah," I said. He looked me over once, then toward the service hall behind him. "Good. Come on." I stepped inside and he let the door close behind me with his foot. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Not one smell, layers of it. Old butter from popcorn that had sat too long under heat lamps, soda syrup dried into carpet, the sharp, damp chemical edge of carpet cleaner that never quite covered what it was trying to cover. Under all of that was the colder smell of conditioned air moving through a building too big for the number of people left in it. The hallway behind the screen wall was narrow and painted in a beige that looked gray under the lights. Utility doors on one side, framed movie posters on the other, most of them lit by weak little bulbs that made the faces in them look washed out and tired. Somewhere deeper in the building, I could hear the tail end of a movie. Not dialogue exactly, more like bass and music bleeding through walls too thin to hold it all back. Under that was the low, steady push of the HVAC, like the whole place was breathing in its sleep. Raymond started walking, and I followed him past a rack of folded wet floor signs and a cart loaded with black trash bags, spray bottles, and a mop bucket with one wheel that clicked every time it turned. This was not the kind of work I was built for, at least not anymore. I'd spent the last few years doing maintenance and equipment work, fixing things that had names and causes and parts you could replace. This was lower, simpler, dirtier, but simple didn't matter. Money did. "Back door after 10, Raymond said. "Front gets locked." I figured. He kept moving. "It's a movie theater. Trash, spills, restrooms, same as anywhere else, just darker." That got the smallest breath of a laugh out of me, though it didn't feel much like one. "I'm just here to work," I said. "That'll help." He said it flat, not like a joke and not like encouragement either. We passed an open supply closet where paper towels and chemical jugs were stacked to the ceiling. Then, we came to the wider stretch of hallway that led toward the auditoriums. The carpet changed there. Darker pattern. Softer underfoot. It muffled everything, including our steps, and the poster lights along that wall were dimmer than the ones near the lobby. Raymond slowed down without quite stopping. Just enough for me to notice. His eyes went down the hallway a second longer than they needed to, toward the deeper set of doors where the numbered auditoriums sat in a row under red exit signs and low blue aisle light bleeding under the frames. He didn't say anything about it. Neither did I. But from that point on, the theater felt bigger than it had from outside. Not busier, not alive, just bigger. Like the walls were holding more dark than the building should have had room for. Raymond reached for the handle of the cleaning cart and pushed it toward me, then turned and headed deeper into the service corridor. I fell in behind him, one hand on the cart, listening to the bad wheel click over the seams in the floor, and by then the place already felt farther from the parking lot than it had any right to. Raymond took me through the place the way a man shows somebody a boat he expects to leak in familiar ways. No big speech. No effort to sell the job. Just one stop after another, one task after another, laid out like he was handing me a list of things that would keep happening whether I was smart enough to keep up or not. The supply closet sat just off the service hall behind the auditoriums, narrow and overpacked, shelves bowed in the middle from years of weight, extra liners, toilet paper, paper towels, spray cleaner, disinfectant, gloves, a stack of flattened mop heads in plastic sleeves. The chemical storage was locked in a metal cabinet bolted to the wall, each jug labeled in thick black marker, because half the factory print had worn off. Raymond opened it, pointed out what got cut with water and what didn't, then shut it again without wasting words. The mop sink was in a concrete room that smelled like bleach and old drains. The basin itself was scuffed gray and stained around the edges. A hose hung beside it, and the floor pitched just enough toward the drain that a little dirty water always sat there in a shallow, dark crescent. The restroom close-out came after the last wave of customers was gone for good. Wipe the sinks, check the stalls, refill paper where needed, hit the mirrors if they were bad enough to bother with, empty the cans. Don't overdo it on nights when the place was light. Don't underdo it on weekends unless I wanted to hear about it the next day. He showed me where the extra trash bags were kept, folded flat in sleeves under the utility shelf. Black for auditorium and lobby cans, clear for some of the backroom stuff. The long grabber hung from a hook by the cart, aluminum shaft, black rubber grip, jaws worn smooth at the tips. "Use the grabber for under the rows," Raymond said. "Got it," I said. That was the kind of thing I liked hearing. Specific, practical. It belonged to the same part of my brain that still wanted this whole job to be simple. In my old work, if a belt slipped or a rooftop unit started short-cycling, you check the obvious things first. Power, connections, wear, heat, airflow. You trusted sequence. You trusted that if something was wrong, the reason existed whether you knew it yet or not. That part of me wasn't gone just because I was standing in a movie theater with a trash cart instead of a service ladder. Raymond walked me through the cleanup order next. Lobby sweep first if the rush had been bad, though most of that got handled while the building was still open. Auditoriums after last showings let out, one room at a time. Cups, popcorn tubs, candy boxes, straw wrappers, napkins, lids, the usual junk people couldn't seem to carry 10 extra feet to a trash can on their way out. Then seat checks, then the floor, then under the rows, then bagging and hauling everything to the dumpster run in the back. Bathrooms near the end unless one got hit especially hard and needed attention sooner. If a spill had soaked through into the carpet, mark it and hit it after the loose trash was gone. Sticky soda patches got a spray first, then mop or towel depending on how bad they were. Most of the job's just volume, he said. That was true of more work than people like to admit. Factory maintenance, building systems, cleanup, loading dock repairs. Half of earning a paycheck in this country was doing the same thing enough times that nobody had to think too hard about whether you'd keep doing it tomorrow. I watched the way he moved through each area. He wasn't quick, exactly, but he never doubled back and never wasted a bend or a step. He had the building mapped in his body, which doors stuck, which corners collected spilled ice and popcorn kernels, which trash cans filled faster than they should. He lifted one auditorium can just enough to judge the weight before setting it back down. I made a point of watching that. There was no dignity in the work, not the kind people talked about anyway, but there was competence, and that counted for something. My phone buzzed once in my pocket while he was showing me the restroom supplies. I didn't need to look to know who it might be. Elaine usually called a little before bed if she hadn't heard from me. If she texted first, it meant she was trying not to feel like she was checking up on me. I left it where it was. Cash was down low enough now that I'd started doing the math automatically any time I touched my wallet. The room at the Coachlight Inn, gas, food, whatever daylight side work I could pick up moving junk, hauling brush, helping a guy on the edge of town swap out a bad disposal or hang drywall sheets he couldn't lift alone. Nothing steady. Nothing worth building a life on. This theater had hired me faster than anybody else had, and that mattered more than my opinion of it. Raymond handed me a stack of fresh liners and showed me how they wanted the cans tied off before the dumpster run, so soda didn't slosh out over the back hall. He pointed out where the restrooms split off from the lobby, where the employee break table sat under a dead vending machine, where the service route narrowed behind the projection side of the building. The farther we went, the more I started to understand the place as a system instead of a maze. Front of house and back of house, customer light and worker light, public mess and private cleanup. It helped. I've always trusted things more once I can see the pattern in them. "Same order every night?" I asked. "Close enough," he said. That answer made sense too. Same order until volume changed it. Same order until a clogged sink or a busted bag or a bad spill pushed one thing ahead of another. Systems bent. They didn't stay pure. You just adjusted. We went into one of the smaller auditoriums that had already let out. The room was empty except for the leftover heat and smell people leave behind when a couple dozen bodies sit breathing in one place for 2 hours. The screen was black. The aisle lights were low. He showed me where people tended to leave the worst of it, near the front corners, under the center rows, around the seats with the best sight line. I picked up a half-full soda that had gone flat and warm, then a tub with grease soaked all the way through the bottom, candy boxes folded in half, napkins stuck under shoes and ground into the carpet. It was ugly but ordinary, the kind of ugly I could work with. My old job had been harder than this in every way that looked good on paper. Better pay, better hours, at least most weeks, more skill, more respect when somebody asked what I did. But respect didn't help much when the place got shut down and everybody started pretending it would all come back online any day now. I could still hear Ron Bellamy saying that in the parking lot outside the shop. Give it a little time. We're working on it. Don't go making permanent decisions over a temporary mess. That had been almost 2 weeks ago. The temporary mess still hadn't called me back. My phone buzzed again. I pulled it out just enough to see Elaine's name on the lock screen, then slipped it back into my pocket before the vibration even finished. Raymond noticed, or maybe he noticed everything. "Then keep moving," Raymond said. So I did. By the time he finished walking me through the first full route, the job didn't feel mysterious anymore. It felt physical, repetitive, manageable. Bags, spills, seats, floors, restrooms, haul out, repeat. My shoulders had loosened a little just from having something concrete to do with my hands. That mattered. Fear doesn't get much room when your brain still thinks the night can be solved by order, weight, timing, and enough passes through the same routine. That was where I still was by the end of the walkthrough. Tired, underpaid, and a little embarrassed to be there, but steady. I knew where the liners were. I knew where the chemicals were. I knew which sink to use, which haul to take, which cartwheel clicked, and how the night was supposed to move from one room to the next. Raymond had given me enough to work alone, which meant the shift was real now. It wasn't an idea anymore. It was mine to get through. We were still moving when he started in on the part that didn't fit. Raymond didn't take me into a break room. He didn't lower his voice like he was about to tell me a ghost story. He kept walking the route, opening doors, pointing with 2 fingers, checking cans and sight lines and the small things a person notices after enough nights in the same building. That was what made it harder to laugh off. If he'd tried to dress any of it up, I would have written him off right there as another older guy with weird habits and too much dead time on the shift. Instead, he folded it in with the rest of the work like it belonged there. We came out of one auditorium, crossed the carpeted hall, and stopped near the deeper run of doors. The lobby noise was gone by then. Whatever last customers had been in the building were either headed to their cars or already gone. The music overhead had cut off too. Without it, the theater sounded bigger. Air moving through vents, a compressor kicking somewhere far off, a faint dry tick from one of the poster boxes as it cooled. Raymond looked down the line of auditorium doors, then at me. "Listen once and save us both a bad night," Raymond said. I thought that was finally going to be the point where he tried to sell me some old man nonsense about the place. I waited for the smile that would tell me he was testing how gullible I was. "You serious?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. That was it. No grin, no pause for effect, just the same flat tone he'd used to tell me where the trash liners were kept. He tipped his chin toward one door farther down the hall. House 6. I only knew the number because the brass plate caught the light when he moved. He said if I came down the hall and found that door already unlocked before I reached it, I wasn't supposed to walk in. I was supposed to stop outside, count to 30, and listen. If I heard credits playing inside, I was to skip the room and keep going. If 6 is open before you get there, you wait outside. I stared at him for a second, then at the door. In my head, I was already building reasons for it. Bad latch, projection issue, some quirk with their shutdown sequence that everybody on staff knew about and nobody wanted to explain to the new guy, because it was easier to turn it into a ritual than fix it. Right? I'd worked around enough old systems to know that people get superstitious when management stops paying for repairs. He started walking again before I could answer. I followed him because that was the rhythm of the night now. Follow, learn, carry, remember. He took me into another auditorium, one of the mid-sized rooms, and shined his small flashlight down along the base of the seats. He didn't hand me the light. He just showed me what he meant. Drink cups kicked under too far, candy boxes slid between seat legs, a phone once in a while, wallets sometimes, keys if people were drunk enough or distracted enough. Then he looked at the grabber clipped to the side of the cart. "Don't reach blind under the seats. Use the grabber." That one I almost agreed with on principle, not because of anything supernatural, because reaching your bare hand into a dark floor-level gap where strangers had been dropping trash all day was a good way to come back up with gum, broken plastic, or something worse. I had plenty of practical reasons not to like the idea. But then he kept going. If something I was trying to retrieve slid farther back on its own, I was to leave it there. Not fish for it, not get on my knees, not lean down to get a better look. Leave it. That pushed it over into the kind of thing I'd heard before from men who'd been doing the same job too long. Rules built around one strange experience that hardened into habit and then into law. Somebody gets startled once by a raccoon in a crawl space, and 20 years later, no one on that crew will open a hatch without knocking first. We crossed to another room, and he checked the floor near the front row with the beam of his light. His face didn't change. He was still talking like he was explaining what cleaner to use on syrup stains. If I found a child's cup with ice still in it after 1:15 a.m., he said, I was not to throw it away with the rest of the trash. I was to carry it down to the screen, leave it there on the floor, and back out of the room without turning my back on the seats. If a kid's cup is still cold after 1:15 a.m., leave it by the screen. That was the point where irritation finally got ahead of politeness, not by much, but enough that I felt it. I'd taken bad jobs before. I'd worked around people with their own little systems and grudges and habits. But there was something about the way he kept laying this out, as if it deserved the same space in my head as mop water and trash routes that got under my skin. I still didn't think he was trying to scare me. I thought he was either too superstitious to realize how he sounded, or talking around equipment problems nobody had bothered to fix. He moved his flashlight up the rows, then clicked it off and headed back into the hall. We stopped at another door, one of the smaller houses near the end. He said if I entered an auditorium and found one seat folded down by itself in an otherwise empty row, I was to leave it alone. Not check it, not kick it back up with my foot, not clean under it. Leave the whole space around it as it was and move on. If a seat's folded down by itself, leave it alone. That one stayed with me more than the others, though I couldn't have said why. Maybe because a cup was one thing, a door latch was one thing, but a seat folded down in an empty room made me picture a body-sized absence in the dark. Not somebody visible. Just the shape of where somebody ought to have been if the room had any right to look that way. He finally got to the last one near the intersection of the back hall and the corridor that led toward the deeper screening rooms. The lights there were lower than they needed to be. Not broken. Just low enough that the carpet color died a few feet out and everything passed that looked flatter and farther away. If a screen powered back on after building shut down, he said, I was not to stand there looking long enough to figure out what was playing. I was to turn my eyes to the exit lights, leave my cart if I had to, and get back to the lobby without running. If it said my name, I was not to answer. If the screen comes back on and says your name, don't answer. He said it the same way he'd said not to overfill the mop bucket. That bothered me more than the rule itself. No build-up, no warning that I should take him seriously. Just the rule itself, placed in my hands like another piece of equipment I'd need later whether I respected it or not. I didn't argue with him after that. I didn't need to. Most of the conversation had already moved into my head anyway, where I was sorting his rules into categories that made sense to me. Old building problems, staff folklore, liability workarounds, the kind of irrational fixed thinking people develop when they spend too many years in one place and every unexplained thing starts to feel personal. I've always trusted an explanation more than a feeling. I still did then, but I also noticed he never once smiled. He never gave me the look people give when they know they're messing with you and are waiting to see if you'll bite. He didn't enjoy any of it. He didn't even seem interested in whether I believed him. He was just handing me procedures and expecting me to keep them straight. At the end of the hall, he stopped beside the cart, pulled a pen from his jacket pocket, and wrote 3 quick notes on the back of a supply sheet clipped to his board. Just fragments, a number, a time, one word underlined hard enough to score the paper. Then, he tore the strip off and handed it to me like a claim ticket. I folded it once and put it in my jacket pocket, mostly because it would have taken more effort to throw it away in front of him. He turned toward the next stretch of corridor, where the carpet darkened and the auditorium doors sat under their little red numbers. "You'll be fine," he said at last, but even that didn't sound like reassurance. It sounded like a man telling me the night could stay ordinary if I didn't make it harder than it had to be. Then he moved off to finish the parts of the shift that were still his, and I stood there with one hand on the cart handle and that stupid scrap of paper in my pocket, telling myself I'd just run into one more older guy with too many rules and too much time to attach meaning to them. I told myself that twice before I started walking. It still didn't feel true enough to settle me. Once Raymond peeled off to finish his side of the close, the job got easier for about 20 minutes. That was almost worse. I took the cart in the order he'd shown me and started with the smaller rooms that had already emptied out. The work itself was exactly what he'd said it would be. Volume. Mess left by people who stopped thinking about a place the second the movie ended. Half-full sodas sweating into cup holders. Popcorn scattered under the front row like somebody had kicked a nest apart. Candy boxes folded and wedged into the gap between seats. Napkins ground flat into the carpet where spilled syrup had dried tacky over them. It was ugly, but it was human ugly. Predictable ugly. I could work with that. I settled into it faster than I wanted to admit. Bag in one hand, grabber clipped to the cart, spray bottle and towels ready when I needed them. I moved row by row, checking seat backs, kicking loose cups out where I could reach them, wiping down the armrests that looked wet or greasy enough to matter. The theater stayed noisy in the way big closed buildings stay noisy. Air through vents. A distant thud now and then from somewhere in the back, the low hum of systems still running after the customers had gone. Once I heard what sounded like a trailer line bleeding faintly through a wall, but it cut off before I could make out words. That all helped. It gave my brain something normal to lean on. By the time I cleared 2 rooms and tied off my first full trash bag, Raymond's rules had already started to feel smaller in my head. Not stupid exactly, but local. The kind of thing a man turns into ritual after too many years in one building. I kept catching myself mentally filing them next to bad habits and workarounds. Don't trust that latch. Don't use that outlet. Don't leave that faucet running too hard or it'll spit rust. Every old place had a few rules nobody wrote down. That was still how I was thinking when I turned the cart toward House 6. The hall there felt a little cooler. Not enough that I could have sworn to it if somebody asked. Just enough that the sweat at the base of my neck stopped feeling warm. The carpet swallowed most of the sound from the cartwheel, so the bad click I'd been hearing all shift seemed softer there, farther away from me than it should have. The little red number beside the door caught the low light first. Then the handle. The door was already cracked open, not wide, maybe 2 inches, just enough that the dark inside sat wrong against the hall light. I stopped harder than I meant to, and the cart rolled another half-foot before I caught it. My first reaction wasn't fear. It was annoyance, real, clean irritation. I was tired, underpaid, and halfway through my first shift in a job I did not want. And now I was standing there thinking about the stupid piece of paper in my jacket pocket because an old janitor with too many warnings had gotten into my head. I looked back down the hall once, half expecting Raymond to be standing there watching to see if I'd do it. He wasn't. There was nobody. Just the line of dark doors, the exit sign glow, and the low thrum of the building around me. I told myself it was a latch, or a staff check, or a customer who'd leaned on the handle on the way out and never got noticed because nobody was looking for anything that small. Then I remembered the exact way Raymond had said it, flat as a checklist item, and that made me mad enough to follow it. I stood outside the cracked door and counted to 30 in my head. Not fast, not dramatic. Just the way you count seconds when you're waiting for a pressure reading to settle. At 11, I felt stupid. At 19, I started focusing on the sound of the HVAC instead, because it gave me something to listen through. At 24, I heard it, faint, thin, farther back in the room than it should have been, like it was coming off the screen and bouncing off the walls before it reached the door. Music first, or what could have been music. Then the soft shape of voices layered under it. Not conversation, not dialogue. The rhythm of names being read or thanked. The kind of sound you hear when movie credits are running and you're already halfway out of your seat. I stopped counting. I stood there another second, with my hand hovering near the door, and every practical explanation I had lined up in my head suddenly sounded weaker than it had a moment before. Not impossible, just weaker. A playlist glitch, some auto loop in the projector system, a booth mistake. Any of that could happen. Probably it happened before, but none of it made the hair along my forearms lift the way it did. I stepped back from the door instead of forward. I hated myself a little for that, not because I thought I was being brave by going in, because I knew exactly what it would look like if somebody had seen me. A grown man with a trash cart, obeying a superstition in an empty movie theater. I put House 6 behind me and moved on without touching the door. The whole time I was walking away, I kept waiting for the credits to cut out and prove I'd let my nerves make the call for me. They didn't. The next auditorium I cleaned was normal enough to calm me down some. More cups, more popcorn. Somebody had left a phone flashlight on in a seat cup holder, and it had killed its own battery, throwing a weak, dead glow into the plastic. That helped too. People cause mess. People cause weird little problems. Most things in any building can still be traced back to people if you have enough patience. I was halfway through the room after that when I saw something shoved under the third row from the back. At first I thought it was a wallet, dark leather shape, half turned on the carpet under the seat line. I parked the cart at the aisle and crouched a little, trying to get the angle on it without going all the way down. It might have been a wallet, could have been a phone case, could have been one of those slim men's billfolds people sit on all through a movie and only notice missing when they're already in the parking lot. My hand started down before I thought about it. I stopped with my fingers halfway to the floor, swore under my breath, and straightened up just enough to pull the grabber off the cart. That irritated me almost as much as House 6 had. I didn't like catching myself obeying him. I slid the jaws of the grabber under the seat line and reached toward the object. Before the rubber tips got within an inch of it, it moved. Not a twitch, not a trick of shadow. It slid backward in one clean little pull, deeper under the row, and out past where my arm could comfortably angle the tool. No scraping, no hand, no glimpse of a shoe or a sleeve, just the object shifting away from me like something had hooked it and tugged. I froze there, bent at the waist with the grabber extended, waiting for the rest of the picture to appear. Nothing did. The room stayed empty. The screen stayed black. The aisle lights glowed low along the steps, and all I could hear was my own breathing and the little electric hiss from the exit signs. I eased back and keyed the radio clip to the cart. 6 was open, I said over the radio. "Did you go in?" Raymond asked. "No, I heard something." "Then leave it," he said over the radio. I looked back under the row, though I already knew I wasn't going to see anything useful there. "Something moved under one of the rows," I said. "Did you touch it?" Raymond asked. I didn't answer right away, and that seemed to be answer enough, because he didn't say anything else. I finished the room. I had to. That was the part I understood best. Trash didn't stop being trash because one thing in the dark had moved when it shouldn't have. The shift still had a shape to it. Bags had to be tied, floors had to be wiped, bathrooms still waited at the end of the route. I told myself the thing under the seat had slid because the carpet sloped more than I noticed, or because I'd clipped it with the grabber without realizing it, or because my eyes were tired and the angle was bad. I got through the rest of the first shift carrying all 3 explanations at once and trusting none of them. By the time I hauled the last bag toward the back and felt the cold early morning air off the service exit, the ugly part wasn't that I'd heard something in House 6 or watched an object move where no hand should have been. The ugly part was simpler than that. Raymond's rules had worked, and I could no longer say with a straight face that they had nothing to work on. I slept badly after the first shift and came back anyway. That was the plain truth of it. I woke up late at the Coachlight Inn with my jaw sore from grinding my teeth and the shape of that moving object still sitting in the back of my mind like a bad taste. I lay there for a while, staring at the water stain on the ceiling over the motel bed, listening to a truck idle somewhere outside my window, and ran through the same options I'd already run through in the parking lot the night before. I could quit. I could decide one shift was enough and go find something else. I could drive south, go home, tell my mother I'd lied to her and that the job I'd been waiting on hadn't come back. None of that solved anything. The room was paid for through Friday morning. After that, the rate jumped if I stayed into another week. I had enough left to cover it if I kept being careful, but not enough to feel good about it. I did a small hauling job that afternoon for a guy cleaning out his shed, took cash, bought gas, ate from a drive-thru because it was cheaper than sitting down anywhere, and kept checking my phone for a call from Ron Bellamy that never came. By the time the sky had gone dark again, I was more tired than I'd been the night before, and no closer to having a better plan. So I drove back to the plaza outside Chillicothe with the same thought in my head I'd had all day. Get through one more night, then reassess. People ruin their own lives waiting on one more night, one more week, one more callback. I knew that. I still did it. The lot looked even deader the second night. Maybe because I knew where I was going now. Maybe because once you've been behind a building and seen the side people aren't supposed to look at, the front never feels the same again. The laundromat was still lit across the lot. The pizza place was dark this time. The theater sign glowed over empty spaces and wind-blown wrappers skittering along the curb. I parked in nearly the same spot as before and sat long enough to check my balance, the motel charge, and a missed text from Elaine asking if I'd made it to the site okay and whether the hotel room was decent. I locked the phone and put it away. Inside, the smell hit faster, like my body already knew it. Stale butter, damp cleaner, old syrup, the cold breath of air moving through the ducts. I used the service entrance again and found Raymond near the back hall tying off a trash liner. He gave me one look, not surprised, not pleased either. "You came back," Raymond said. "I need the hours," I said. That was all either of us did with it. No welcome, no warning. Just acknowledgement and then work. If he had thoughts about whether I should have stayed gone, he kept them to himself. That bothered me more than a speech would have. The first part of the shift stayed ordinary enough to make me angry at myself all over again. I cleared the early rooms, picked up the same cups and tubs and candy boxes, wiped down the same sticky armrests, worked the same route. My hands remembered faster the second night. Tie bag, lift can, swap liner, push cart, spray, wipe, move. I knew where the towels were now, which hall cut across quickest, which auditorium had the worst floor slope near the front row. Systems helped, repetition helped. Once I was moving, my head had less room to circle the things I didn't want to think about. Even so, I kept checking the deeper hall without meaning to. Every time I crossed the corridor that opened toward House 6, my eyes went there first. I never saw anything from the hall. The door stayed shut when I passed it early in the night. The little brass number sat in the low light looking as harmless as any other. That almost made it worse. A closed door can make you feel stupid in a different way than an open one. Just after 1:15 a.m., I was in House 3. I remember the time because I checked my phone right before I walked in. No call from Ron, no follow-up from Elaine, which somehow made me feel worse than another text would have. The room had let out light that night. The mess wasn't terrible. A few medium drinks, a popcorn tub split at the seam, one of those family-sized candy boxes crushed flat under a shoe print. I was halfway down the center section when I saw the cup. It sat crooked beside the leg of a seat about 4 rows up from the front. Bright Kid's cup, cartoon print, straw still in it. At a glance, it looked like any other leftover soda until I bent down and touched the side. It was cold, not cool from air conditioning. Cold in the way something fresh from a fountain machine feels when the ice hasn't had time to lose the fight yet. The paper side had gone damp with condensation, enough that it wet my fingers. When I lifted it, I heard the soft little knock of ice shifting inside. For a second, I just stood there holding it, feeling the cold against my palm and trying to build a better explanation than the one waiting for me. Maybe the family had been in the late show. Maybe somebody set it down after the room cleared. Maybe a teenager from staff had carried it in there and left it. There were explanations. There always were. But they all had to get past the time first. It was after 1:15 a.m. The room had been empty long enough that the air should have taken the edge off it. It should have felt watered down and tired, same as the rest of the place. Instead, it felt new. I stood there with the cup in one hand and the radio clipped to the cart. Then I keyed it. "There's a kid's cup in 3, I said over the radio. "Cold?" Raymond asked. "Still cold? Then leave it by the screen," he said. I hated doing it, not because it was hard, because it made me feel ridiculous in a way work usually doesn't. I carried the cup down the center aisle toward the blank white screen with every row of empty seats behind me and set it on the carpet where the wall met the floor. Up close, the screen had that faint, dusty smell stretched vinyl gives off when a room has been sealed most of the day. I crouched, set the cup down gently like that mattered, and stood back up, trying not to think about what I was about to do next. Then I backed away, slowly, facing the seats. I didn't rush because rushing would have made it worse somehow. I just stepped backward 1 row at a time, eyes tracking over cup holders, headrests, armrests, the dark gaps between them. The aisle lights along the steps gave everything a weak blue edge. Halfway to the door, I heard it. Not a voice, not a footstep. A soft, settling sound, the kind upholstery makes when weight comes onto it. A low give in the padding, then a tiny, dry drag of fabric against fabric, as if somebody had adjusted in the seat after sitting down. I stopped moving for 1 full second. In that second, the room changed. I can't explain that any cleaner than that. Nothing jumped out. Nothing became visible. But the room stopped feeling empty. It was like the air had taken on structure, like the rows weren't just rows anymore, but occupied rows, and I happened to be the only thing in there still standing. Then I kept backing up because standing there longer seemed like the one thing guaranteed to make it worse. I made it out to the hall without turning around, breathed once too hard, and told myself I'd just worked myself up. That was what fatigue did. That was what low light did. A man spends one night following stupid rules, and the next night his nerves start building on the pattern. I almost believed that again for another 20 minutes. The next rooms were dirty and ordinary. One had spilled nacho cheese on the floor by the front row. Another had a trail of popcorn leading all the way to the exit like somebody had been dropping it one handful at a time on purpose. I got my breathing back. My shoulders loosened. The work steadied me. By the time I entered the next small auditorium near the end of the hall, I was irritated at how much headspace that cup had taken from me. The room looked empty when I stepped in. Screen black, house lights dim, no sound except the building itself. I worked from the top row down, collecting cups, lifting trash, checking cup holders with my flashlight. I was midway through the center section when a seat in the row ahead of me dropped. It wasn't loud, just the quick padded clap of the bottom folding down under its own weight. I went still with a handful of napkins in one glove and my flashlight pointed straight at it. The seat sat open in the middle of an otherwise empty row. No body, no coat, no shape leaning there. Just one seat down, armrests on either side, like somebody had just decided to sit and happened to be invisible by the time I looked. I keyed the radio without taking my eyes off it. "A seat just dropped on its own," I said. "Then get out of that room," Raymond said. I didn't argue. I didn't step closer either. I backed toward the aisle, then toward the door, carrying the trash I already had because some stupid part of me still needed to act like this was a job and not surrender. When I reached the hall, I left the rest of that room unfinished. That was the second thing I hated most about the night. Not the sounds, not the cold cup, not the seat. It was the fact that I was now adjusting my work around them. By the time I clocked out and drove back to the Coachlight Inn, I knew one thing anyway. After closing, the place wasn't empty. I almost didn't make it to the third night, not because I'd decided to quit. Quitting would have meant deciding something, and I was still in that cheaper, meaner part of a bad stretch where I kept mistaking delay for strategy. I almost didn't make it because I overslept at the motel after maybe 3 hours of real sleep, woke with the side of my face creased from the pillow and my neck stiff, and spent the next 10 minutes staring at the buzzing phone on the nightstand like it had personally done something to me. The front desk at the Coachlight had left a message about the next week's payment. Not threatening, not yet. Just a reminder in that careful motel tone that says they already know exactly how long you've been there and how close you probably are to not being able to stay. I checked my account, did the math again, and came up with the same answer I'd come up with the last 5 times. I could cover the room if I cut everything else close. I could cover gas if nothing went wrong. I could not keep doing both for long. There was still nothing from Ron Bellamy. I checked twice, once before coffee and once after, even though I knew there wouldn't be. No voicemail, no text, no, "We're getting people back in next week." No nothing. By then, the silence didn't feel temporary anymore. It felt like I was being avoided. Elaine had left a voicemail around lunch. I listened to it sitting in the driver's seat with the engine off, outside a hardware store where I'd stopped to buy nothing and walk around under fluorescent lights for 15 minutes, just to avoid going back to the room too early. Her voice was normal, which somehow made it worse. She asked if I was eating right. She said she'd found one of my old sweatshirts in the wash and folded it back into the hall closet, because she figured I'd want it when I got home. Then she laughed softly at herself and said she guessed I wouldn't be home for a while if they really had me working all the way up near Chillicothe. She told me to call when I could. That voicemail should have made me get in the car and drive home. Instead, it made me feel trapped. Going back without answers would mean hearing the disappointment even if she tried to hide it. It would mean saying Ron Bellamy hadn't called because there might not be anything left to call about. It would mean admitting that I'd taken a night janitor job in a movie theater because it was the first place that needed a body fast enough not to ask many questions. So I showed up again. By the time I pulled into the lot for the third night, the dread was already there ahead of me, settled in and waiting. The plaza looked exactly the same as it had the first 2 nights. Same bad yellow parking lot lights, same long strips of black storefront glass, same theater sign, same feeling that the whole place had emptied itself out except for one building that hadn't gotten the message yet. Inside, the smell hit me harder because I was already worn down. Old butter, damp cleaner, dry carpet, the cold mechanical breath of the building. Raymond was in the back hall near the supply closet, loading fresh liners onto the cart. He looked more tired than he had the first night, if that was possible. Not weaker, just thinner somehow, like the shift took a visible layer off him every time he worked it. I stood there with one hand still on the cart handle and asked the question I'd been carrying since the second night. "How long has this been happening?" I asked. "Long enough," Raymond said. "That's not an answer. It's the one you're getting." He kept loading bags after that like the conversation was over, which I guess it was for him. For me, it just sat there and got heavier. By then, I knew enough to understand he wasn't refusing because he enjoyed it. He was refusing because, whatever this thing was, he had made peace with knowing only the part of it he thought was survivable. I hated him for that a little. I also understood it. He was less available from the start that night. A restroom problem up front, a delivery issue with one of the back stock rooms, something involving a lock on an exterior service door. I never got the full story because he never bothered to give it. The effect was the same either way. I was more on my own than I'd been the first 2 nights. Once you know a place has something wrong in it, being alone doesn't just mean being alone. It means losing your last excuse for every sound you hear. Nobody else to blame it on. Nobody else to ask if they heard the same thing. The hallways felt longer on the 3rd night. The stretches between auditoriums felt more open and less safe. I kept waiting to turn a corner and find House 6 standing there with the door cracked again, but for most of the shift it stayed shut. The first few rooms were ordinary enough to steady me. Trash, cups, floor spots, one bathroom sink with a wad of paper towels stuffed down the drain. Real work, physical work. I leaned on that as long as I could. But every time I crossed the deeper hall, some part of me was listening ahead. It was past 1:30 a.m. when I saw the light. Not bright at first, just a change at the far end of the corridor, where one of the auditorium doors stood with a pale band of moving light under it. Not House 6, one of the rooms across from it. For 1 second I felt relief, which tells you something ugly about where my head was by then. Then the relief went away, because the light under the door wasn't static. It shifted, flickered, changed tone. A screen was on. My first thought was still practical. Booth issue, playlist restart, a projector that hadn't shut down all the way. I moved toward it faster than I should have, radio clipped to my belt, keys tapping against my thigh. The door was shut, but not latched tight. I pushed it open just enough to look inside. The auditorium was empty. No end credits, no ads, no menu screen. What filled the screen looked at first like dim road footage, shaky and low contrast, the kind of thing you'd see if someone was recording through a windshield with a phone in bad light. The image drifted past familiar fence lines and dark roadside brush. Then it straightened out, and I knew what I was looking at before I wanted to. The county road heading back toward Waverly. Not exactly. Not clean enough to swear to in court, but close enough that my body recognized it ahead of my brain. The bend near the old mailbox cluster. The tree line cut back on one side. The feel of a road I'd driven too many times half awake in early morning dark. The image rolled forward another few seconds and turned into a gravel drive with tire ruts I knew. My mother's driveway. The weak porch light over the side door. The shape of the detached garage standing black beside it. I forgot the rule long enough to take another step inside. Then the sound came up. At first I thought it was just static under the image. Then it shaped itself into something too clear. Nicholas, not loud, not shouted, just said, calm and close through speakers mounted high on the walls. I keyed the radio before I realized my thumb was already moving. A screen just came back on, I said over the radio. Don't watch it, Raymond said over the radio. Too late for that. I was already looking. The picture on the screen shifted again. Not to another road, not to another exterior. It cut to the old work site where I'd spent the last 3 years pretending things were headed somewhere. The side bay door, the chain-link fence, the patch of gravel where Ron Bellamy used to stand and smoke before first shift. It looked wrong in the same way the driveway had looked wrong, real enough to hit me, off enough that I couldn't pin down why. Then I heard my name again. This time it came with the dry speaker pop of a paused voicemail. Nicholas. My mouth opened before I had any idea what I was going to say. That was the worst part, not the voice itself, the reflex, the human reflex to answer when something addresses you in a room that should be empty. I shut my mouth and stepped back instead. The door slammed behind me. Not all the way shut, but hard enough that the crash went through the hall and into my ribs. I spun toward it, and in the same movement, heard my cartwheel scrape 3 feet across the carpet behind me. When I looked, the cart had shifted out of the spot where I'd left it, angled toward the auditorium entrance like somebody had put a hand on it and steered. Every hall light still burned. Every door still looked normal. But the corridor had changed. It had that same occupied feeling House 3 had taken on when I backed away from the cup, only stronger now. Not one room, the whole stretch, as if every shut door on both sides of the carpeted hall had somebody behind it sitting still and listening. My voice came out flatter than I expected. It said my name, I told him. A beat of radio static. Then Raymond asked, "Did you answer?" No would have been the easy answer, except it didn't feel clean enough. I hadn't spoken back. But for 1 second, I had started to. Something in me had leaned toward it. Something in me had recognized the invitation before the fear caught up. I didn't answer him right away, and that was answer enough. I got out of that corridor because every part of me that still trusted sequence and cause and practical decisions agreed on one thing. Whatever had been happening the first 2 nights was over. The thing in the building was not just leaving signs behind anymore. It wasn't an empty room with a bad sound cue or a cold cup where there shouldn't have been one. It had shown me something chosen for me. It had used my name. It had waited for me to answer. By the time I reached the brighter stretch near the lobby and finally let myself breathe hard, I understood something I hadn't wanted to understand before. The theater wasn't just full of leftover activity after closing. Something in it knew who I was now, and it was trying to talk to me like I belonged there. After the screen in that auditorium used my name, I stopped pretending the rest of the shift was normal. I still worked. That was the ugly part of it. I kept moving because movement felt closer to control than standing still did. I cleared a restroom near the lobby with my hands shaking just enough to make the paper towel dispenser rattle when I slammed it shut. I hauled one half-full trash bag to the back and came back for the cart because leaving it there felt worse than going to get it. I told myself I was finishing the night because walking out early would cost me hours, and that was true. It just wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that I didn't know what to do with myself if I left. If I got in the car and drove south, I'd still be the same man pulling into that driveway outside Waverly. Same empty account getting lower by the day. Same missed call that never came from Ron Bellamy. Same lie sitting between me and my mother at the kitchen table. There are things a man can postpone by staying busy. Shame is one of them. As long as I kept moving through that building, bagging trash and wiping down counters and checking rows, I didn't have to decide what came after. Raymond was somewhere up front dealing with whatever had taken him away earlier. I could hear him once in a while over the radio talking to someone in the lobby, but for a few minutes, I had the back hall to myself. I parked the cart by the supply closet and sat down on the dead vending machine beside the break table because my legs had started to feel hollow under me. That was when I pulled out my phone. I shouldn't have. I knew better even then. But people reach for whatever feels familiar when the floor under them starts to shift, and my mother's voice had been a constant in my life longer than anything else. I opened the voicemail she'd left that afternoon and played it again with the volume low. "Nick, call me when you can, honey," Elaine said in the voicemail. Her voice carried that soft, tired warmth it always did late in the day, like she was already halfway into winding down for the night. I could picture her in the kitchen without trying. One hand on the counter, glasses low on her nose if she'd been reading anything, looking out toward the dark yard while she talked because she never liked listening to her own voice on a message. I just wanted to hear your voice. That was all it took. No tears, no speech about missing me, no suspicion in it. Just that one plain sentence, loving and ordinary and trusting, and it landed harder than anything I'd seen on a screen that night. I sat there with the phone in my hand and felt something inside me loosen in the worst possible way. Not relief, the opposite. The kind of weakness that makes a person want one impossible thing more than they want the truth. I wanted to go back 3 weeks. I wanted Ron to call and tell me the shutdown was overblown and everybody was coming back Monday. I wanted to drive home with groceries in the passenger seat and let my mother keep believing I was tired from work instead of from lying. I wanted the version of my life where this shift, this motel room, this whole stretch of nights had never happened. I locked the phone and put it away, then sat there another few seconds with my eyes on the dark service hall and the low blue spill of light coming from farther down by the auditorium corridor. The building sounded wrong again, not loud, just arranged wrong. Too much quiet in one direction, too much space in another. Then I heard her. "Nikki," a woman's voice said from the dark. It came from the hall to my left, soft and uncertain, exactly the way Elaine would call for me if she thought I might be in another room and didn't want to raise her voice through the house. My whole body reacted before my brain did. My shoulders tightened, my head turned, my chest went hot and cold at the same time. The hall was empty. The voice had not echoed the way real voices do in that building. It had landed close, almost intimate, as if someone had stepped just around the corner and didn't want to startle me. I stood up too fast and hit the side of the dead vending machine with my knee. The pain helped for half a second. "That's not her," I said. I said it because I needed to hear myself say it, because the first dangerous thing about false comfort is how quickly the body takes it in before the mind can object. I knew where my mother was. I knew she was at home outside Waverly, probably with the television on low and the kitchen light off by then. I knew she was not standing barefoot in the back hall of a movie theater outside Chillicothe, calling my name in the dark. But for 1 second, before I said anything, some part of me had wanted her to be. That was the part of me it knew how to use. I took the radio off my belt and keyed it with fingers that felt clumsier than they should have. It took Raymond a second to answer, and in that second, I kept my eyes on the empty hall because looking away felt like permission for something to move. "It used my mother's voice," I told Raymond. A little burst of static came back first, then his answer, low and tired and immediate in a way that told me there was no part of this that surprised him anymore. "It uses whatever gets you to stay," Raymond said. That settled into me harder than I wanted it to. Not because it explained everything. It didn't. It explained almost nothing, but it named the shape of the danger better than I had. Up until that point, part of me had still been thinking in terms of the building trying to scare people off. Warnings, strange signs. Don't go here, don't touch that, don't look too long. Something territorial, something leftover and defensive. That wasn't what this was. It wasn't trying to drive me out. If it wanted me gone, it had easier ways to do that. It could have kept to cold rooms, moving objects, and voices in the dark. It could have let fear do the work. Instead, it had shown me my mother's driveway. It had shown me the old work site. It had used my name. And now it had used the one voice on earth most likely to reach past my pride, past my common sense, past the thin, ugly layer of stubbornness that had kept me in that theater for 3 nights straight. It was trying to offer me relief. That was where it got personal. Not just fear, not just exhaustion. It was making me feel the exact shape of what I was missing, and then holding it up in front of me like something I could still have if I made one bad choice, if I answered, if I followed, if I stood there long enough to believe the wrong thing because believing it would hurt less than going home and telling the truth. By then I understood something worse than any rule Raymond had given me. The worst thing in that theater wasn't what it could show me. It was how well it understood what I wanted. I found Raymond in the narrow stretch behind the lobby where the service hall widened just enough for 2 carts to pass each other without scraping. He was standing by the mop sink with one hand braced on the edge of it, looking down into the basin like he'd forgotten why he'd come in there. The overhead light above him had that weak yellow tint some old fluorescents get before they die, and it made the hollows under his eyes look deeper than they had even an hour earlier. He looked up when he heard me coming, took one look at my face, and didn't ask what I'd seen. That was enough to make me angrier than if he had. I stopped a few feet from him with the radio still in my hand and the pressure of my mother's voice still sitting high in my chest where it didn't belong. For a second, I couldn't decide what I hated more, the thing in the building or the fact that Raymond had been carrying some version of this alone for long enough to stop reacting to it. "What is it?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He reached past me, shut the mop room door most of the way, and glanced once down the hall toward the auditorium corridor before he looked back at me. "It's what stays after everybody else leaves," Raymond said. I stared at him, waiting for more, and when he didn't keep going on his own, I felt the frustration sharpen into something cleaner. Why the rules? Because the place keeps count. That landed harder than I expected it to, not because it made immediate sense, because some part of me had already started to understand it and didn't want to. I thought about the folded seat, the cold cup, the credits behind the door in House 6, the way the building had felt occupied in sections without ever showing me enough to say by what. "Count of what?" I asked. "Who's still here when the credits end?" The room went quiet except for the hiss of the fluorescent above us and the far-off rumble of air moving somewhere in the ceiling. I wanted to push back on it, and part of me did. Count was the kind of word that can mean anything if a man's trying hard enough to be mysterious. But Raymond wasn't performing. He didn't look interested in sounding profound. He looked tired. Past tired. Like he had spent too many years working around a thing he could only survive by reducing it to the fewest words possible. He pushed off the sink and leaned back against the concrete wall, still watching the hallway more than me. After closing, he said, "The place wasn't empty. Not all the way." The older staff had never had a clean name for what stayed behind, and the ones who'd lasted longest were the least likely to try to invent one. Some people called them holdovers. Some just called them the late crowd. It didn't matter. The mistake people made was treating the building like it had fully gone back to being empty the second the last customers left. It hadn't. Not in every room, not every night, but enough. He said House 6 was where it sat strongest. He never offered a reason. Maybe he didn't know one. Maybe reasons had stopped mattering a long time ago. All he said was that some rooms cooled off and went blank after the last showing, and some didn't. Some rooms kept a little shape of what had been in them. House 6 kept more than that. As he talked, things from the first 2 nights shifted into place in a way I didn't want them to. The child's cup hadn't been trash, not to whatever stayed after closing. The seat that folded down in the empty row hadn't been empty at all, not in the only way that mattered there. Even the object under the seats on my first night looked different in my head once I stopped insisting the building still belonged only to the people on payroll. The rules were never about fighting anything. That was the part that changed everything. I'd been hearing them like warnings meant to keep me safe from random manifestations. Don't touch this because it's dangerous. Don't go in there because something's wrong. But that wasn't the structure of them at all. They weren't weapons, and they weren't charms. They were manners, in the ugliest possible sense. Procedures for not interrupting, not acknowledging, not responding, not getting yourself mistaken for part of what remained after the public part of the night was over. That was why I wasn't supposed to throw out the cold cup, why I was supposed to leave the folded seat alone, why I was supposed to stand outside House 6 and listen before walking in, why the screen was the worst rule of all. Why is the screen worse? Because once it knows what you want, it'll show you, Raymond said. There it was, plain and clean and ugly enough to hold every part of the night that had stopped making sense on its own. The road to Waverly, my mother's driveway, the old work site, my name through the speakers, her voice in the dark. None of it had been random. It hadn't been rummaging through old images for atmosphere. It had gone straight at the one part of me that was weakest, the part that still believed relief might come from outside if I could just hold out a little longer. A call from Ron. A normal drive home. my mother still trusting the version of me I'd been trying to preserve. I asked Raymond if this had happened to anyone else. He didn't answer directly, which was answer enough. He said people who lasted didn't ask for details they didn't need. People who wanted details usually didn't last. A few had walked out in the middle of shifts and never come back. One or two stayed long enough to start making the wrong decisions, looking too long, going into the wrong room after hearing something that sounded familiar, picking up what should have been left alone, talking back when they were called. After that, they either quit fast or came back wrong, distracted, slower, drawn toward the deeper halls even when there was no reason to be there. He said the place didn't take everybody all at once. Sometimes it just started counting them before they understood what was happening. That was the first time real fear got ahead of irritation in me. Up to that point, some part of me had still been trying to frame everything as encounters with a fixed problem, something local and containable if I followed the steps. But if what Raymond was saying was true, then the rules weren't keeping me away from danger in the simple sense. They were keeping me from being recognized by it, or worse, accepted by it. I thought about the instant in that auditorium when my mouth had opened to answer my own name. I thought about the way my body had leaned toward my mother's voice before I'd told myself it wasn't real. I thought about how quickly I'd started adjusting my route around the room with the dropped seat, as if I'd understood deep down that somebody else was already occupying that space, and I was the one trespassing. Raymond watched me go through all of that without saying much. He didn't need to. The shape of it was clear now, whether I liked it or not. The theater, after closing, still had an audience in it. Not in every seat, not every room, not every night with the same weight, but enough to matter. The final danger wasn't being attacked. It was being drawn into participation, hearing your own name and deciding the rules no longer applied because what was calling you sounded kind, sounded useful, sounded like a way out. House 6 was where that line got thinnest. That was why the credits mattered. That was why Raymond kept talking about waiting outside and listening first. Not because end credits were spooky on their own, but because they marked the point where a normal audience should have been leaving. If something was still there after that, then the room no longer belonged to the same side of the night I did. I finally understood the real shape of the problem, and it was worse than anything simpler would have been. If I answered the wrong voice, followed the wrong image, or stood in House 6 long enough to let the screen pull me into what it was offering, the building would stop treating me like staff. I wouldn't just be a man on shift anymore. I'd be one more person still in the room after the credits should have emptied it. That was the logic behind all 5 rules. And by the look on Raymond's face, he thought I was already close. I should have left as soon as Raymond told me what the rules were really for. That would have been the smart version of the story. I would have taken the radio, walked straight out through the service exit, and let the rest of the shift rot where it sat. But the cart was still down the deeper corridor, and part of me was still stupid in the ordinary way work makes people stupid. You keep thinking one last task still matters, even after the night has stopped belonging to the job. Raymond must have seen it on my face, because he didn't waste time trying to argue me out of it. He just told me to keep the radio on and not look into anything I didn't have to. Then, the signal on his end thinned out again, like the building was already deciding how much of him it was willing to let through. When I looked back toward the deeper corridor, the cart was no longer where I'd left it. It had been moved back down near House 6. The hall toward House 6 was brighter than it should have been, not in a dramatic way. That almost would have been easier. It was just fully lit, every wall light burning, every brass number over the doors sharp and visible, every worn patch in the carpet suddenly easier to see. My cart sat halfway down the corridor, angled toward House 6, as if somebody had nudged it there and left it waiting for me. I walked toward it with my hand already on the radio. I told myself I was there for the cart, for the path back out, for the simple fact that I needed to get past that stretch of hall if I wanted to leave it all. Those things were true. None of them were the whole truth. The whole truth was that some part of me wanted to see if the room would try again. Before I reached the cart, House 6 opened on its own, not wide, not theatrical, just enough for the latch to click and the door to ease inward a few inches. White blue light leaked into the hall under the frame and across the carpet. I stopped with one hand on the cart handle and felt that same ugly pull I'd felt earlier in the night. Not fear, relief. The possibility of not having to carry my real life for another minute. That was what got me moving. Not courage, not curiosity, relief. I pushed the door wider and stepped inside. The room looked empty, rows falling away toward the screen, aisle lights low and blue, no bodies, no shape standing in the front, no figure waiting in the seats. But it wasn't empty. You could feel that right away. The air in there had weight to it, like I'd walked in after people had already settled and I was the one arriving late. The screen was already on. What it showed at first looked like a call screen, but not a real one. More like someone's idea of one built out of memory. A black rectangle floating over blurred images that kept shifting before I could settle on them. The road south toward Waverly, my mother's gravel driveway. The old worksite with the fence line and the side bay where Ron Bellamy used to stand and tell us to be patient. Then the image steadied. Ron was on the screen. Not exactly. Not enough that I could have believed it in daylight. But enough. He stood by the gate in his jacket, shoulders hunched the way they always were in cold weather, and looked into the camera like he was finally about to say the thing I'd been waiting to hear all week. The image cut before he could. Then my mother was there in the kitchen at home, turning from the sink with that tired look people get when they're doing one more thing before bed. The voice came through every speaker in the room at once, calm and close and certain. "Nicholas Ward," a voice said from the screen. I didn't answer. I barely breathed. "You can go home now." That was the shape of it, not threat, permission. The screen shifted again and gave me exactly what permission would mean. The old place reopened, Ron calling me back in. My mother never knowing about the motel, the lie, the weeks I spent waiting for a call that didn't come. The whole mess erased without me having to earn that erasure by telling the truth. I stood there too long. Then the image shrank, and the credits started beneath it. At first, I thought it was just more of the trick, some fake movie ending laid over the life it was offering me. Then I saw the names: utility, closing crew, late clean, floor reset. They rolled in plain white type over the bottom of the screen, steady and quiet, and halfway through them I saw my own name. Nicholas Ward. That landed in me colder than anything else had, not because I was surprised, because I understood it. The room wasn't just trying to tempt me, it was placing me, counting me, moving me from the side of the people who cleaned up after the showing to the side of the people still in the room when the showing should have been over. I heard my own voice before I fully meant to use it. "That's not real," I said. The screen flared brighter. At the same time, one seat in the center section folded down with that soft padded clap I'd heard the night before. Then another, lower. Then a third closer to the aisle. Not random. A path, a line of occupied spaces forming its way toward me, one row at a time. The radio burst alive on my belt in a wash of static, and Raymond's voice cut through it hard enough to feel like a hand on my shoulder. "Don't let it seat you," Raymond said over the radio. That was the thing I needed to hear, not because it was brave, because it made the choice plain again. The room didn't need me to believe in it. It needed me to accept the version of my life it was showing me badly enough to stay put while it finished making a place for me. The seats kept dropping in that slow, measured line. I backed up one step, then another. I didn't look into the rows. I didn't try to find what wasn't visible there. I kept my eyes on the screen only long enough to know where the lie was, and every step backward felt like pulling my foot out of wet ground. The air in the room had gone colder, My hands were numb around the radio and the cart handle. On the screen, my mother still stood at the sink. Ron still waited by the gate. The names kept rolling. Then I was through the doorway. The second I crossed into the hall, the seat sound stopped. Not faded. Stopped. I yanked the door shut and stood there holding the handle while the light under it pulsed once, twice, then flattened back into an ordinary strip of brightness. Raymond met me farther up the hall, alive, breathing hard, not heroic and not surprised. Between us, that was enough. Ron Bellamy never called. I stopped checking before the week was out. I left the motel, drove south, and went home outside Waverly under a sky the color of old metal. Elaine was in the kitchen when I came in. She smiled first, then looked at me harder and knew something was wrong before I opened my mouth. "Mom," I said, "I need to tell you something." So I did. Not about House 6, not about the screen, just the part of the truth I could still carry in daylight. The job was gone. I'd been staying in a motel because I was ashamed. I hadn't wanted to come home looking like I'd failed. It hurt her. It relieved her. It did both at once, the way truth usually does when it shows up late. Life didn't fix itself after that. Money stayed tight. Work stayed uncertain. Nothing came back the way the screen had promised it would. But I came home. The rest stayed with me. Weeks later, I was sitting in the living room with a movie on because Elaine likes having a television on in the evenings. The film ended. Credits began to roll over soft music. I got up before the first names were halfway through and walked toward the kitchen without looking back. Behind me, in that dark room hush that only exists after something on a screen is finished, I felt the unmistakable weight of a seat settling open.